The stage from Rawlins came down the last grade into Lone Tree at 4:30 on a bright cold afternoon in the middle of May, 1886. And when the door swung open, the first thing the town saw come out of it was a flour sack. It came out ahead of the woman who carried it, because the step was high and she had to swing the sack down before she could manage her skirt. And it landed on the boards of the platform with the soft, settled sound of a thing that is not heavy and is not full. It was a cotton sack, cream-colored, washed until the mill's blue printing had faded to the gray of a winter sky, and it was tied at the neck with a length of red carpet yarn. Everything in the world that belonged to Adeline Fenn was inside it, and the sack was not full. Behind her, 2 other passengers came down, and both of them had trunks. That was the part the loafers on the bench outside the Mercantile would tell over for a month afterward. The drummer from Omaha had a tin trunk with his samples strapped on the top of the coach, and the ranch wife coming back from her sister's had a hide trunk with brass corners. And the third passenger, the one everybody had come out to look at, had a flour sack tied with red yarn and a dark blue shawl that had been turned once and mended along the fold. Adeline had known for 11 days what the shape of her arrival would be, and she had decided somewhere out past the Platte that she would not pretend about it. She had written to him already. She had written it in the plainest sentence she could build and had put it in the middle of the second page, where no man could later say he had read past it in bad light. Everything I own fits in one flour sack. She had blotted the line and read it back to herself in the cold hallway of the boarding house on Common Street in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and then she had folded the page and posted it before she could soften it, because she had learned in 27 years that a thing hidden becomes a betrayal the moment it is found, while a thing said first becomes only a fact, like weather, that 2 sensible people can build around. She had expected the letter to end it. She had expected no answer at all, or a short answer, or the kind of answer that speaks about the will of Providence for 1 page and then regrets. What came instead was a folded sheet with the smell of sheep on it and 11 words written on it, and a ticket, and a money order for the coach fare from the railhead, and she had carried all 3 in the front of her dress across 2,000 miles. Now she stood on the platform with her chin up and her heart going hard and looked for a man she had never seen. He was standing at the near end of the walk with his hat in his hand. That was the first thing Adeline ever knew about Abel Kerrigan, and it was worth knowing. He had taken his hat off before she was fully down the step, and he held it against his leg the way a man holds it in church, and he did not move toward her the way the men at the depot in Omaha had moved toward women, quick and sideways with their hands already out. He waited where he stood and let her come to him, so that the choosing of it would be hers. He was a tall man, past 6 feet, heavy through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man who has spent his life lifting things that fight him. His hair was dark, near to black in the shade of the porch, and the short beard on him had gone a shade lighter at the chin from the sun. His eyes were gray and deep-set, and there was an old mark along his jaw where a horse had caught him once. He wore a brown canvas coat gone pale at the elbows, a blue chambray shirt, and a wide hat the color of dust, and a shearing tally book was buttoned into his breast pocket, because it was May, and May was the only week of the year that decided anything. Adeline crossed the boards with the sack held in both arms. "Mr. Kerrigan," she said. "Miss Fenn." Then neither of them had anything more, and the whole town watched them not have it. The loafers watched. The postmaster watched from behind his window. 2 boys watched from under the water trough. And Adeline Fenn, who had rehearsed a great many sentences on the coach and found every one of them useless, did the only thing she had left to do, which was to hold the flour sack out a little way from her body into the light where he could not miss it. "You will have read my letter," she said. "I meant it plainly. This is all of it. This is everything I own in the world. It is one flour sack, and there is room in it yet." She heard her own voice come out level and was glad of it. "There is no trunk coming behind on the freight," she said. "There is no chest of linen, and there is no chest of anything else. There is a second dress in here, and a comb, and my father's things. I would rather you knew it here, on the boards, in front of the town, than found it out in a month, and thought I had let you believe otherwise." Abel Kerrigan looked at the sack a long moment. Then he looked past her, up the street, to where his wagon stood at the loading chute of the wool house with the tailgate down, and Adeline followed his eyes because she did not know what else to do with her own. The wagon bed was stacked with something pale and enormous, folded flat in bales, a great heap of coarse cream-colored cloth roped down under the sideboards. "Do you know what those are?" he said. "No, sir. Wool sacks. 80 of them, come out from St. Joseph on the cars, 7 foot long apiece, and every one of them empty as a Sunday." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I have got 3,200 head coming down off the winter ground, 11 men of my own, and a shearing crew hired out of Utah that will be here Thursday. In 9 days, every one of those 80 sacks has got to be filled and sewed and hauled to the siding, and what they bring is the only money this outfit will see until next May." He put his hat back on. He said it quietly, and he said it to her and not to the town, but the town heard it anyway, and the town would repeat it for 20 years. "So you have got 1 sack, Miss Fenn," he said. "Then fill my wool sacks. I have got 80 of them, and nobody to say what goes inside." Adeline stood in the cold, bright wind off the flats with her arms around everything she owned, and something went through her that she could not have named at the time and named later, in her old age, when a granddaughter asked her about it, as the exact moment the ground stopped tilting underneath her, because there was one thing in that flour sack Abel Kerrigan did not know about yet, and it was not a dress, and it was not a comb. Her father had been a wool sorter. Not a shepherd, not a rancher, not a man who had ever in his life stood in an open country like this one. Ephraim Fenn had spent 31 years at a wire-topped sorting table in the top room of a scouring mill on the Merrimack River, under a long row of north windows, breaking open fleeces that came in by the shipload from Australia and Ohio and this very territory, pulling them apart with his 2 hands into the 11 grades the trade knew, throwing each grade into its own bin, and never once in 31 years throwing wrong. Adeline had been carried up those stairs on his hip before she could walk. She had known the smell of grease wool before she knew her letters. She had stood on an upturned box at the end of his table from the time she was 6, and been allowed to handle the sorted piles, and by 9 she could tell fine from half-blood with her eyes shut, and by 12 the foreman was letting her open the sample bales because her hands were small and quick and did not tear the staple, and by 19 she was sorting a full table of her own on the women's side of the room at $7 a week, which was a wage no woman in that mill saw anywhere except in the sorting room. The sorting room was the one place in the building where a mistake could not be hidden, and so they had simply to have whoever could do it. The mill shut its sorting floor in the winter of 1884, when the new machinery came in and the buying moved to Philadelphia. Her father died the March after, of the lungs, the way sorters died, full of 31 years of dust. There had been the funeral and the doctor and the room rent and afterward there had been $11, a comb, a second dress, a leather sorter's apron worn shiny across the belly, a brass staple rule, and a flat tin box of sample cards. All of it went into one flour sack. And the sack was not full, and that was how a woman who could read a fleece the way a banker reads a note came down the step of a coach at Lone Tree in the territory of Wyoming, 9 days before the shearing. He put the flour sack on the wagon seat between them, not in the back with the freight, and Adeline understood the courtesy of it and said nothing. The road out of Lone Tree ran north and then west along a bench of sage, and for the first 2 miles neither of them spoke, and the silence was not unkind. The country opened the way a book opens. She had lived her whole life in a river town where the sky was a strip of gray between 2 brick walls and the noise never stopped, day nor night, because the looms ran on into the dark and you heard them through the floor of every room you ever slept in. Here there was no wall anywhere. The land went out brown and silver and green and went on going, and the mountains stood along the west of it, with snow still on them in May, and there was no sound at all except the wheels, the harness, and the wind coming over the sage with a dry, sweet smell in it she had never met before. "It is very large," she said at last, which she knew was a foolish thing to say. "It is," Abel said. "First time I came out here, I could not sleep for a month. Too quiet. I kept getting up to see what had stopped." She laughed before she could decide whether to, and he glanced over, pleased, and looked back at the team. He told her the plain facts of it as they drove, the way a man lays out a hand of cards he does not intend to hide. The place was called the Split Rock, and it lay 11 miles out, and he had come to it 13 years before with a brother who had since gone to Oregon. He ran sheep, not cattle, and he had taken a certain amount of unpleasantness for that from certain of his neighbors over the years, though less than he used to. There was a house of squared logs with a stone chimney and a plank floor, which he said twice, because the plank floor mattered. There was a well with sweet water. There were 11 men on the payroll at shearing and 4 the rest of the year, and there was a woman, Mrs. Odell Pruitt, who had cooked for him since the year of the hard winter, and who ruled the kitchen absolutely and would not thank anybody for interfering with the stove. "And a shearing crew coming Thursday," Adeline said. 9 of them, out of Ogden. Machine men, though they will use blades on the bucks. They shear for the count and they move on, and what they leave behind them is my whole year in a heap on the floor. He said it evenly, but she heard the thing sitting underneath it. "Mr. Kerrigan," she said, "may I ask you a question that is not a delicate one?" "You may ask me anything at all," he said. "That is what this is. How did last year's clip sell?" The wagon went 30 yards before he answered, and when he did his voice had gone flat. "Badly," he said. Then, because he had told her he would answer anything, he told her the rest, and it came out of him harder and faster than he meant it to, the way a thing does when a man has been carrying it alone for 11 months. They had shorn 19,600 pounds the previous spring, which was a good weight for the count. They had thrown the fleeces as they came, tied them, and packed the whole of it as it lay, every fleece the same as every other fleece, into 58 sacks, and hauled it to the siding, and consigned it east to a commission house in Boston that his neighbor had used for years. The account of sales came back in September. Adeline would remember, ever after, the exact way he said the word account. The house had thrown the clip into the lowest line they had. The account gave the reasons in one printed column: heavy in burr, tags packed with body wool, black fiber through the lot, and the whole marked unmerchantable as delivered and sold at the price of the lowest sort in the bale. It came to 11 cents a pound gross, and after the freight and the charges he had cleared under $2,000 on a clip that ought to have brought better than $3, and he had wintered on it. And he was still paying the mercantile in Lone Tree for the winter he had wintered on it. Black fiber, Adeline said quietly. There is a bunch of black sheep in the band, my brother's foolishness, years back. You cannot get them out of a flock once they are in it, and every man out here has got some. How were they shorn? With the rest. And the fleeces thrown in with the rest. Everything was thrown in with the rest, Miss Fenn, he said. That is what packing a clip is. You put the wool in the sack. He did not say it sharply. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes to be simply true. And Adeline sat with her hands in her lap and looked out over the sage and did not say what she was thinking, which was that in the top room of a mill on the Merrimack River there were 11 bins, and that the entire difference between a poor man and a comfortable one might be lying loose on the floor of a shearing shed in the territory of Wyoming, with nobody in the country who knew how to pick it up. She did not say it. It was her first day. She had learned early that a person who comes in from outside and tells everyone their business on the first day is not listened to on the second. The split rock came up out of the land the way everything came up out of that land, all at once. When they crossed the last low rise, there was the house with its stone chimney, and a barn, and a long, low shearing shed of weathered plank with a sheet iron roof, and the pens beyond it, and the corrals, and the great slow river of the flock coming down off the north ground in a dust of its own making. 3,200 head, so many that the noise of them arrived a full minute before the smell. 11 men came out to look at her, and Adeline, who had spent her life among people who worked, knew within a minute that she was not welcome, and knew within 2 minutes that it was not personal, and could not for the life of her have said why. Dorsey Pike told her why himself, 4 days later, standing at the wool bench with his hat off and his ears red, because he was a decent man who had been raised to say a hard thing to a person's face rather than behind them. He was near 60, wiry, gray, with a drooping mustache and a face like a saddle that had been left out in the weather for 20 years, and he had run sheep for Abel Kerrigan for 9 of them. You will be thinking we are a poor lot of neighbors to you, he said. I had thought something like it. Then I will tell you the 2 reasons, and you may make of them what you like. The first one is a woman named Ivy Coley. Ivy Coley had come out on the same coach line the spring before, answering the same advertisement in the same column of the same paper. She had stayed at the Split Rock 11 days. Abel had given her $40 out of the wool money to order a cook stove of her own, choosing from the catalog at the mercantile, because she had said the kitchen wanted one, and on the 12th day she had taken the $40 and gone back east on the coach, and had not left so much as a note behind her, and there had been no stove. And the men had watched Abel Kerrigan ride into Lone Tree 3 separate times to meet coaches that she was not on. He never said a word against her, Dorsey said. Not then, not since. That is his way, and it is a good way, and it is also why the boys made up their minds on their own. They decided they would not learn the name of any woman who came out on that coach until she had wintered here. It is nothing to do with you, ma'am. They will not say good morning to you until Christmas, and then all at once they will, and you will not know what changed. And the second reason? Dorsey Pike looked at his boots. The second reason is the clip, he said. That account of sales come back with my name on nothing, but it was my shearing floor. 19,000 pound of wool, and it graded out at the bottom of the sheet. There is not a night since September I have not laid awake going back over it, and I could not tell you now what I done wrong, because I done it the same way I have done it for 30 years, and the same way every outfit in this basin does it. So when a woman off the cars from a mill town walks up to my wool bench and starts moving wool around on it, ma'am, you will forgive me if I go somewhat stiff in the neck. I will forgive you, Adeline said. And I will tell you what you did wrong, if you would like to hear it. And you will not like it. Try me. You put the whole of your clip in one line, she said, and the trade paid you for the worst handful in the sack. That first evening, before any of it, there had been the house. Mrs. Odell Pruitt met her at the door with flour to the elbows and looked her over once, top to bottom, the way a woman of 60-odd years looks over another woman she has been told to expect, and then took the flour sack out of her arms without asking, and carried it inside as though it were a trunk with brass corners. There is water hot, she said. There is a room made up. Supper is at 6, and it does not wait for anybody, and the man has been sweeping this floor for 11 days like it was going to be inspected by the governor. The floor was planks, planed and scrubbed pale, and there was a rag rug on it, and a table, and a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, and above the fireplace a shelf with a clock that did not go. The room they had made up for her had a bedstead with a rope frame and a quilt, and a washstand, and a window that looked west at the mountains, and a nail behind the door with nothing on it. Adeline stood in the middle of that room for a while with her hands at her sides. She had slept for 2 years in a boarding house room with 3 other women and a stovepipe running through it. At supper, the men ate at the long table in the cook shack, and she ate in the house with Abel and Mrs. Pruitt. And Abel said grace, and then he set down the plain business of it in front of her, the same way he had set down the wool sacks. There is a thing we had best say out, Miss Fenn, so that neither of us is guessing, he said. Reverend Pardoe comes through this country the first Sunday of every month. If you are of a mind to, he will be at Lone Tree the first Sunday of June, which is 3 weeks off. If you are not of a mind to, or if you get here and find you have made a mistake, then I will drive you back to the coach myself and pay your passage home, and there will be no word said about it, not by me and not by anybody who eats at my table. You have come a long way on 11 words from a stranger. I would think less of you if you did not want to look at the stranger a while first. And if I do want the first Sunday in June, then I will be the gladdest man in the territory of Wyoming, Abel Kerrigan said, and I will still not have any linen, and it will not matter. She slept that night better than she had slept in 3 years, and woke before light out of the habit of a mill town, where the first bell went at 4:30, and lay listening to a silence so complete it had a sound of its own. Then she got up and dressed and went out into the blue dark with her shawl around her and walked down to the shearing shed, because she could not have stayed away from it if the building had been on fire. The shed was 110 feet long, plank walls, a sheet iron roof, a dirt floor packed hard as a road, and a long line of shearing stands down one side with the chutes behind them and the pens beyond. Somebody had swept it. At the far end, where the light would come in best through the wide doorway, stood the wool bench, which was a bench in the way that a plow is a bench. 8 feet of 2-inch plank on trestles, worn hollow in the middle, with a broken draw knife lying on it, and a coil of tarred twine. And stacked along the wall behind it, in flat cream-colored bales, were the 80 sacks. Adeline set her lamp down on the bench and stood looking at them for a long time. Then she went back to the house and came down again with the flour sack and untied the red yarn and took out the 2 things that mattered: The first was her father's apron. It was heavy skirting leather, black with 31 years of grease and gone the color of a saddle where his belly had rubbed it, with a pocket across the front that had held the brass rule. And when she put it on, it hung to her ankles, and she had to take up the neck strap by 2 full holes. The second was the tin box. Inside the tin box, wrapped in oiled paper, were the sample cards. There were 62 of them. Each one was a rectangle of stiff pasteboard with 8 or 10 little locks of wool sewn onto it in a row with linen thread, and under each lock a number in her father's hand, and along the top the name of the grade and the year and the shipment. They had come off the sorting floor of a mill that no longer had a sorting floor. There was territory fine on them, and half blood, and 3/8, and quarter blood, and low quarter, and britch. And there were cards of the same grade from 4 different years so a sorter could see how a season changed a fleece. And there was one card, the one she had carried on the top of the pile all the way from Massachusetts, that had 8 locks of the finest combing wool she had ever handled in her life, off a shipment out of this very territory in the spring of 1879, that had gone into a bolt of cloth somebody wore in Boston and never thought about once. Adeline laid the cards out along the wool bench in the lamplight, in their proper order. Fine at her left hand, coarse at her right, 62 cards in a row, and put her palm flat on the plank between them, and that was how Abel Kerrigan found her at sunup, standing in a man's leather apron that came to her ankles, in an empty shed, with the whole trade of wool laid out in front of her like a hand of cards. He stopped in the doorway with the light behind him and did not say anything for a moment. "What is all this?" he said. "This is my father," she said. She turned around, and her face was wet, and she did not apologize for it, and he came down the shed slowly and stood at the bench and looked at the 62 cards and put out one finger and stopped himself. "You may touch them," she said. "They are only wool. That is the point of them." So he touched them. He ran his thumb across a lock of territory fine and then across a lock of coarse britch from the same shipment, and Adeline watched his hand and saw the exact instant he felt the difference, because his thumb went back and did it again. "That one is soft," he said. "That one is the neck and the shoulder of a merino EO, and it is the best wool that comes off a sheep. That one your thumb is on now is off the britch, which is the hind leg and the tail end of the very same animal, and it is coarse and it is full of color, and it will not spin fine. In a mill they are 2 different articles with 2 different prices, and they go to 2 different rooms in the building, and they end up as 2 different things in the world. One of them is a wedding suit. The other one is a horse blanket. And last spring, Abel said slowly, I put them both in the same sack. You put 11 grades in the same sack, Mr. Kerrigan, and then you sent them to men whose entire trade is knowing the difference, and asked them to pay you as though there were no difference. And they did the only thing men in that trade have ever done. They opened the top of the sack, they found britch and burr and black fiber in with your finest, and they priced the whole 19,600 pounds of it at the worst thing they could see. There was a silence in the shed. Out in the pens a ewe called, and another one answered. How much, said Abel Kerrigan, was the difference? And Adeline Fenn, who had been in the territory of Wyoming for 14 hours, looked at her 62 cards and did the sum in her head the way her father had taught her to do it. In cents, standing up, without a pencil. On a clip of 20,000 pounds, she said, sorted honestly and sacked by line, and marked so a buyer can see what he is buying. At the prices they were quoting in the Boston market in April, which I read in a newspaper in Omaha while I waited 11 hours for a coach. The difference is not less than $1,500. It may be nearer $2,000. And it is lying on the floor of this shed every May, and it has been lying there for 13 years. Milo Renfro came out to the Split Rock the next afternoon, which was a Tuesday, 2 days before the shearing crew was due. And he came out for the same reason he came out every year in the last week of May, which was that a man who buys wool on the ranch buys it cheapest before it exists. He drove a light buckboard with a good bay horse in it, and he wore a black frock coat and a checked waistcoat and a low derby hat, and he was lean and clean-shaven with black hair combed flat, and he had a way of standing with one boot up on a wagon spoke that suggested he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. He bought for himself and sold to a house in Philadelphia, and he had bought the clip of 11 outfits in that basin for 9 years running, and he was not a wicked man. He was only a man who had noticed, long before anybody else in that country, that the men who grew the wool did not know what it was worth and had no way to find out. He shook Abel's hand and touched his hat to Adeline and did not ask who she was, which meant he already knew, which meant the mercantile in Lone Tree had done its work. "Same as ever, Kerrigan," he said. 14 cents, run of the flock, in the grease, sacked as she lays. Cash money at the siding when you deliver. No freight for you to pay. No commission. No waiting on Boston till September to find out what they feel like giving you. He smiled. "You will recall what Boston felt like giving you last September. I recall it. Then you will recall it took you till March to pay Hollis at the mercantile. 14 cents on 20,000 pound is $2,800 in your hand on the day you deliver. And a man can plan on money he is holding. He cannot plan on money that is on a train." It was, Adeline thought, standing at the corner of the shed with a bucket in her hand and her heart beating in her ears, a very good speech. It was a good speech because most of it was true. That was the thing she had learned in the sorting room about the men who came up from the counting house. They never lied when the truth would do the work. "I will think on it," Abel said. "You will think on it," Renfro agreed pleasantly, and got up into the buckboard and gathered the lines, and then said the thing that changed the shape of the whole week. He said it to Abel, but he said it loudly, and he said it toward the shed, where Dorsey Pike and 2 of the hands were leaning on the rail. "I hear you have got yourself an expert out from the East," he said. "I hear she has got cards with wool sewed on them. Now, Kerrigan, I have been buying in this basin 9 years, and I will tell you for nothing, because I like you, this country eats mill notions for breakfast. A girl who has never in her life seen a live sheep is going to stand at your bench in shearing week and tell 9 Utah men how to throw a fleece. And your crew will lose 2 days, and your clip will go out late, and you will take 12 cents from me in June instead of 14 in May, and you will have had your lesson." He touched his hat again, to Adeline this time, without malice, almost kindly. "No offense to you, ma'am. It is a hard trade, and it is not a woman's." Then he drove away, and the dust of the buckboard hung in the still air for a long while, and nobody at the Split Rock said anything at all. Adeline set down her bucket. She walked to the pens where 400 ewes stood waiting for Thursday, and she went in among them with her skirt gathered in one hand, and the men watched her do it, and one of the hands started forward to stop her, and Dorsey Pike put out an arm and stopped him instead. She took hold of a ewe. She had never in her life taken hold of a live sheep, and the ewe knew it instantly and swung her weight, and Adeline went down on one knee in the dirt and got a fistful of the fleece along the shoulder anyway, and stayed down there with her cheek against the animal's flank and her fingers working into the wool. Then she got up. Her dress was ruined and her hair had come down on one side. "Mr. Pike," she said, "would you come here, please, and bring your hand?" Dorsey came because he was curious, and because a man who has been 60 years in the world knows when something is happening. "Put your fingers in there," she said, "down at the skin, on the shoulder. Not the top of it, the bottom." He did it, now the same on her breech, back by the hind leg. He did that too, and he stood there a moment with his hand in a sheep's wool, and his face changed, and he said, "Well, I will be." "Say it out loud, Mr. Pike." "They ain't the same wool," said Dorsey Pike, in the tone of a man reading a word he has looked at every day for 30 years and never once sounded out. "They are not the same wool," Adeline said. "They have never been the same wool. There is fine combing on her shoulder and her side that will bring you better than $0.25 a pound in Boston this June, and there is breech on her hind end that will bring you 15 cents if you are fortunate, and there are tags under her tail, which is dung-locked wool, which is worth 8 cents, and which pulls down every pound it is packed against because it is filthy and because a buyer who finds it in the top of the sack stops believing anything else you have told him. And on Thursday morning when the crew starts, every bit of that is going to come off her in about 4 minutes and land on this floor in one heap, and you are going to sack it as it lays. And Mr. Renfro is going to pay you 14 cents for the shoulder and the breech and the tags all together, and sell the shoulder alone for 28. There was a silence in the pen. "That is what a sorter is," she said. "A sorter is not a notion out of a mill. A sorter is a person who stands at a bench and says, 'This pound is one thing and that pound is another thing, and I will not let you buy them for the same money.'" Dorsey Pike took his hat off, which she did not understand at the time and understood later, and said, "How many hands would you need?" And that was how the argument was won at the Split Rock, in a sheep pen, in a ruined dress, 2 days before shearing, without one raised voice. They did the rest of it at the long table in the cook shack that night, with a lamp in the middle and 11 men around it, and it was Abel Kerrigan who called them in, and it was Abel Kerrigan who ended it. Dorsey put the practical objections, and they were good ones. Sorting takes hands, and every hand at the wool bench is a hand not in the pens. Sorting takes time, and a shearing crew paid by the head does not slow down for anybody. Sorting takes room, and the shed was already too small. And the last one, which he put quietly and which was the real one, if they broke the clip into lines and the lines were wrong, they would not have made a poor sail. They would have made a laughingstock of the outfit in a basin where a man's name is his credit at the mercantile. Abel listened to all of it. Then he stood up. "Here is how it will be," he said. "The crew shears. Nobody slows the crew. Dorsey has the pens and the chutes and the crew, and that is his. And I will not have it interfered with by me or by anybody. The floor is hers. From the moment a fleece leaves the shearer's hand, it belongs to Miss Fenn, and what she says about it is what happens to it, and I will back her against any man on this place, including myself. She will have the wool bench and the far end of the shed and the 80 sacks. She will have Tobin, and she will have the Bassett boy, and she will have Mrs. Pruitt for the tying, and she will have me every hour I am not horseback. And when it is sacked and sewed and marked, we do not sell it to Renfro at the gate. We haul it to the siding, and we sell it on the grade to a buyer who has to open the sacks and look." He put his hands on the table. "I am going to say the last part plain because you are grown men and you have got wages in this. If she is right, we all eat better. If she is wrong, that is on me, and I will make your wages good out of the cattle money and out of the sale of my brother's horses, and no man here loses $1 by it. Now go to bed. It is Tuesday, and Thursday is coming. Wednesday they built it. Adeline had drawn it out on the back of a feed bill the night before, and what she had drawn was the top room of a scouring mill on the Merrimack River, shrunk down and turned into pine and rawhide and whatever was lying in a Wyoming barn. The first thing was the table, and the table was the whole secret, and there was nothing to it at all. A wool sorter's table is not solid. It is a frame with a top of woven wire, coarse as a garden trellis, standing waist high, and it works, because when a fleece is thrown out flat on it and shaken, everything that is not wool falls through. Sand falls through. Seed and burr fall through. Dust falls through, and short-second cuts fall through, and the dirt of a whole winter on the open range falls through. And what is left lying on the wire is the fleece itself, opened out with the shoulder at your left hand and the breech at your right, exactly as it grew on the animal, ready to be read. There was no woven wire at the split rock. There was, in the loose pile behind the barn, 140 feet of rusted hog fencing that had been taken down off the horse pasture in a wet spring years before, because nobody could think of anything else to do with it. They cut it and stretched it and nailed it over a frame of 2x4s 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, and set it on trestles at the height of Adeline's hip bone, and stood back and looked at it, and Tobin Reese, who was 19 and lanky and freckled and had said perhaps 40 words since she came, said, "That is a table you can see through. That is a table that pays for itself before dinner," she said. Around the table they set the bins, and the bins were the old lambing hurdles laid over on their sides and lashed with wire, 5 of them in a half circle, and each one lined with a spare wagon sheet so the wool would not pick up splinters. 5 bins, not 11. She had thought about that for most of the night, lying in the dark listening to the coyotes. 11 grades was the mill. 11 grades was a room with north windows and 8 men who had done nothing else for 30 years, and it would be a vanity to try it here, and if she tried it she would fail, and the failure would be public, and Abel Kerrigan would pay for it out of his brother's horses. 5 lines was a thing a green crew could hold. 5 lines was a thing a buyer could open and understand in 4 minutes standing in the wind at a railroad siding. So she chalked the 5 on the plank wall behind the bins in letters a foot high, and they held for the rest of her life, and long after, because the outfits in that basin went on using her 5 lines for 30 years, and most of them never knew whose they were. The first bin was the fine combing, which was the shoulder and the side and the back of every good ewe in the flock, long and bright and soft, the wool that goes to a worsted mill and comes out as a suit of clothes a man is buried in. The second was the medium clothing, the shorter and stronger wool off the older ewes and the wethers, and off the belly of the fine ones, which the trade wanted just as badly and paid less for. The third was the low and the breech, the coarse hind quarter wool, honest and worth honest money the moment it stops pretending to be anything else. The fourth was the black and the gray, every fleece off the black sheep and every fleece with so much as a handful of colored fiber in it, taken out whole and kept apart, because one dark fiber in a bale of white will show in the finished cloth as a fault the dyer cannot cover, and the trade will punish a whole clip for it. The fifth was the tags, which is the dung-locked and matted wool off the tail and the hind legs, and which she would not have in the shed at all. She had the boys sweep it straight out the door into a hurdle of its own in the open air, to be sacked last and marked plain, and never at any time to touch clean wool. "You are throwing away money," Dorsey said, watching Tobin sweep. "I am selling it separately for 8 cents, instead of letting it cost me 13 cents a pound on everything it lies against," she said. "It is the same money, Mr. Pike. It is only honest." Then there was the press. Every outfit in the basin had the same one, a box press, which is a bottomless plank box the height of a man standing over the mouth of a sack. And you fill the box, and a boy gets down inside it and tramps the wool solid with his feet. And you fill it again and again, and the sack comes out, weighing 300 pounds and standing up on its own like a fat old man. Abel had 2 of them. She had them both moved to the far end of the shed by the door, one for the fine and one for everything else, because the one thing she could not risk in 9 days of noise and hurry was a boy tramping medium wool into a sack with fine wool already in the bottom of it. The last thing was the marking, and she did that herself with a pot of lampblack and a rag on the flat of every sack after it was sewed. And it was not writing, or not only writing. It was the mill's own shorthand, 1 broad stripe for the fine, 2 for the medium, a cross for the low and breech, a filled circle for the black, and the tags left bare with nothing on them at all, so that a buyer standing in the wind at a siding could see the whole clip laid out and know before he opened a single sack what was in front of him. Why not just write the words? Tobin asked her. "Because a stripe cannot be argued with," Adeline said, "and because a buyer likes a clip he can read from his horse. Half of this trade is telling a man the truth in a way that saves him time." There was one thing more, and it was not built. It was driven, and it belonged to the herder. Bastien Elizalde had come to that country out of the Basque provinces at the age of 20, and had been 11 years on the Split Rock, and he was a broad, brown, stocky man in his 40s with a heavy black mustache who wintered alone with the band in a sheep wagon and who spoke to human beings about 4 times a season. Adeline had said good morning to him twice, and had been answered with a nod. On the Wednesday afternoon she walked out to the holding ground with her chalk and her feed bill and asked him, through Dorsey, whether it would be possible to cut every black and every gray sheep out of 3,200 head and hold them apart until the last day. Bastien listened to the whole of it. Then he said, in English, which surprised everybody standing there, 109. I beg your pardon? 109 black, 9 gray. I know every one. I count them in the winter for something to do. He looked at the chalk in her hand. You want them shorn last, all together, so no black wool goes on the floor where the white is thrown. Yes, exactly that. Good, said Bastien Elizalde, and turned his horse, and had them cut out and standing in their own pen by dark. 109 black and 9 gray, and did not say another word to anybody until the following Tuesday. They worked until dark and then passed it with lamps, and at some point in the evening Adeline looked up, and there was Mrs. Odell Pruitt in the doorway of the shed with her sleeves rolled, having decided something on her own, saying only, Show me the tying then, and mind you say it once, and say it right, for I have got bread rising. And at some point later than that, when the boys had gone up, and there was nobody in the shed but the 2 of them and a lamp on the new wire table, Abel Kerrigan stood on the other side of it with his hands flat on the frame and said, I want to say a thing, and I am no hand at saying things. Then say it badly, Adeline said. I will not hold it against you. When I wrote back to you, he said, I did not write those 11 words because I felt sorry for a woman with 1 sack. I want that understood, because you are going to hear it said in town. I wrote them because I have been out here 13 years, and I have learned that what a person brings is not the same as what a person is worth, and I have got no earthly use for a wife who arrives with a wagon of furniture and no reason to get up in the morning. I did not know what you could do. I could not have guessed it in 100 years. I only knew that a woman who tells a stranger the worst thing about herself in the middle of the second page, where he cannot miss it, is a woman I would be safe with for 40 years. The lamp went on burning between them on a table made out of a horse fence. "Mr. Kerrigan," said Adeline Fenn, "on the first Sunday in June I would like very much to be married to you." "Well," Abel said, and had to stop and start again. "Well, that is fine. That is fine." He looked around the shed as though he had never been in it. "Then we had best get some sleep, because the crew comes at 6 and there is a year's living lying out in those pens." The crew came at 6 on Thursday morning, 9 men out of Ogden in a spring wagon with their gear in a wooden box, and by 20 minutes past 6 the shed had turned into the loudest building in the territory of Wyoming. Adeline had never seen anything like it, and never afterwards saw anything that reminded her of it except one thing, which was the weave room of a mill running full. It was the same. It was noise with an order inside it. The chutes rattled and banged as the ewes came up, and the shears clattered, and the men called the count down the line, and every 40 or 50 seconds another ewe went naked down the ramp into the counting out pen with that scandalous look they all get, and another fleece came off the boards in one piece. The Utah men were paid by the head. That was the fact under everything else in that shed, and she had thought about it half the night. A shearer who is paid 7 cents a head does not care what happens to the wool once it is off the sheep, and he will fight anything, however sensible, that puts 1 second between him and the next ewe. The ringleader of them was a black-bearded man of 40 named Wick Halloran, who had shorn in Australia for 6 years, and he came down to the wool bench in the first hour, with his handpiece still in his fist, and said, not rudely but not gently either, "Ma'am, if you are going to stand there and hold up my fleeces to the light one at a time, I will be here till the 4th of July. How many can you do in a day, Mr. Halloran?" 110. 130 if the wool comes off easy and nobody bothers me. "Then do 130, Adeline said, "and I will not touch a fleece until it is out of your hand, and I will not once ask you to stop or to slow or to wait on me. I want 2 things from you, and they will cost you nothing, and I will pay you for both. Name them. Take the tags off first, before you start the belly, and throw them behind you on the floor, the way you did it in Australia. And when the fleece comes free, do not drop it. Throw it flat on that wire table there, backbone down, the way you would throw a blanket on a bed. It is the same motion you make now, only you finish it 3 feet to the left." Halloran looked at the table, and at her and at Abel Kerrigan standing behind her with his arms folded and his face saying nothing at all. "That is a shed table," he said. "That is an Australian table. Who put that in a Wyoming shed? I did. With hog fence. With hog fence." Wick Halloran laughed for the first time that morning, a short bark of a laugh, and shook his head, and said, "Half a cent a head, half a cent a head, and there are 9 of you, and you will earn it back for us before dinner," Adeline said, and put out her hand, and the black-bearded man shook it in front of the whole crew, which was the last of the arguing that ever happened at that bench. After that they got a rhythm, and the rhythm was the thing she remembered. A fleece came flying and landed flat on the wire, and Tobin and the Bassett boy took a corner apiece and shook it once, hard, and the shed dust went down through the hog fence in a gray rain, and the fleece lay opened out on the table exactly as it had grown, with the shoulder at Adeline's left hand and the breech at her right, and she went down it with both hands the way her father had gone down 31 years of them. She could do 1 in 14 seconds. The count for the day was the crew's, not hers, but she kept her own count in her head out of habit, and she never lost it. Her hands did the work, and her mouth called the lines out loud. Because Mrs. Pruitt was at the bins and could not see the wool from where she stood, fine, medium, fine with the breech off, black, medium, low, her right hand pulled the breech off the hind end in one motion and threw it right. Her left hand took the neck and the shoulder if the neck was heavy with burr and threw it into the medium. The clean body of the fleece went to Mrs. Pruitt to be rolled flesh side out and tied, and the tie was a single turn of the fleece's own neck wool, no twine, because twine in a bale is a fault and a mill will charge you for it. 14 seconds of fleece, 480 fleeces a day, and the pile in the fine bin grew like bread rising. On Friday, the men began saying good morning to her. On Saturday, it rained. It came in over the mountains at 2 in the afternoon with no warning to speak of, a cold squall with hail in the front of it, and it caught 140 ewes standing in the outside holding pen with their fleeces on, and it soaked them to the skin in under 10 minutes. Everything stopped. Adeline stood in the doorway of the shed and watched the rain come across the flats in a gray wall, and Dorsey Pike came and stood beside her, and after a while he said, "Well, they will steam off overnight in the shed if we crowd them in. They will not be shorn tomorrow," she said. "Ma'am, we are 2 days behind the count as it is. Mr. Pike, if we shear a damp sheep, we put damp wool in a sack. And if we put damp wool in a sack and press it to 300 pounds and sew it up and stand it against a wall for a fortnight, then somewhere between here and Boston that sack heats. It goes yellow in the heart of it, and it rots, and it can burn a barn down. And I have seen a bale opened in a mill yard that had a black hole through the middle of it like a stove had been in there. There is no price for that wool. There is not a low price. There is no price." Abel came up the shed behind them wringing water out of his hat. "How long?" he said. 2 clear days of wind and sun, and I will have Tobin turn them on the hurdles, and I will put my hand into every one of those 140 fleeces myself before it is shorn, and if it is not dry to the skin, it waits another day." "Then it waits," Abel said, and turned around and went back out into the rain, and that was the end of that discussion. And it cost them 2 days, and it very nearly cost them the sale. Because Milo Renfro heard about the rain in Lone Tree on Sunday, the way he heard about everything, and on Monday morning he was standing in the shed doorway in his black frock coat with his hat in his hand, looking down the long dim room at the 5 bins and the wire table and the sacks standing in rows, and he was not smiling any more. "Kerrigan," he said, "I will be honest with you, which is more than most in my line. You are behind, you have got wet sheep, and you have got a clip broken up into 5 parcels. And there is not a buyer between here and Omaha who will thank you for that. A buyer wants 1 lot. 1 lot, 1 price, 1 wagon load of trouble. You have made yourself 5 lots, and every one of them is small. So here is where I stand, and I will not come back out here again. 12 cents. Run of the flock, all 5 of your parcels together as she lays, cash at the siding Friday. That is under my price, and I know it, and you know why. Because come Friday it is my wagons, or it is nothing. And there is not a soul else in this basin buying." He put his hat on. "That is $2,400 near enough for a year of your life," he said. "Or you can stand on that siding on Friday with 70 sacks of striped wool and no buyer and hope the cars take it east on consignment. And you can wait till September to find out what Boston thinks of your stripes. You did that last year, Kerrigan. It took you till March to pay Hollis." He got into the buckboard. "Friday," he said. "Noon," and he drove away, and this time nobody at the Split Rock said anything for a good deal longer. He is right about one thing, Adeline said that night at the long table, with all of them there and the lamp burning low. There is no buyer in this basin. There is not going to be a buyer in this basin, because Mr. Renfro has spent 9 years making sure of it, and that is not wickedness. That is business, and I have watched better men than him do worse in a mill office. Then we are talking about nothing, Dorsey said, not unkindly. We are talking about the fact that there is no buyer in this basin, she said. There are a great many buyers on the Union Pacific. She had it worked out by then. She had lain awake with it 2 nights running, and she laid it out on the oilcloth in front of them. And it was so simple that Abel Kerrigan afterwards said it was like watching somebody open a door in a wall he had walked past for 13 years. In the 3rd week of June every year, the wool buyers came west. They came out of Boston and Philadelphia on the cars with their sample bags and their scale weights, and they worked the sidings along the Union Pacific from Cheyenne to Green River, buying the Territory Clip where it stood on the platform, and they did it every summer of their lives, and her father had sorted for one of them for 11 years. The house was Cutright and Beale of Boston. Ephraim Fenn's own hand was on 40 of the 62 cards in the tin box, and the man who had bought the wool those cards came off was named Ames Cutright, and he had come up through the sorting room himself, which in that trade is a thing men do not forget about one another. He will not come to a ranch, Adeline said. He will not come 11 miles off a railroad for one clip of 20,000 pounds, and I would not ask him to. But he will step down off a train at a siding he is passing anyway, and open a sack if there is a reason. So we will give him a reason, and we will give it to him in the only language that trade speaks. She had been making them for 4 days without telling anybody, in the evenings, sitting up at the kitchen table with a needle. Sample cards. Her own this time, not her father's. 5 rectangles of pasteboard cut off the back of the Mercantile's catalog, and on each one sewn down in a neat row with linen thread out of Mrs. Pruitt's workbox. 8 locks of wool taken from the 5 bins of that shed, off that flock, out of that spring, the fine combing, bright and long, the medium clothing, the low and breech, the black, and the tags, which she sewed on too, and which nobody else would have sent. You are sending him the tags, Abel said. I am sending him the tags, she said, because I am telling him what is in my sacks, and a man who tells you about his worst line before you ask is a man you can buy from at a distance. That is the whole of it, Mr. Kerrigan. That is what my father sold for 31 years, and it was never the wool. It was that when Ephraim Fenn said a bin was fine combing, you could bale it unopened and put it on a ship. They went into Lone Tree on Tuesday morning, the 2 of them on the wagon seat, and it cost them $1.80 at the telegraph key in the corner of the post office. And Adeline wrote the message herself, and counted the words twice, and cut it down until it was nothing but bone. It said that there were 20,000 pounds of Territory clips sorted into 5 lines at the Split Rock and standing on the siding at Lone Tree from Friday, that the sorting was mill sorting, that the sorter was the daughter of Ephraim Fenn, who had sorted in the top room on the Merrimack, and that samples of all 5 lines were coming by that day's coach. Then she put the 5 cards in a flat tin and wrapped it, and paid the coach agent 40 cents to carry it east to the railhead and put it into the hands of the agent at Rollins for Cutright and Beale. And then, because there was nothing else in the world they could do about it, they went home and finished the shearing. They finished on the Thursday. It took 11 days in the end instead of 9, and the last 200 head went through in a wind that took Tobin's hat clean over the pens and into the sage, And when Wick Halloran turned loose the last ewe, he stood up and stretched his back and shouted the count down the shed, and the count was 3,214 head, and the crew cheered themselves the way shearing crews have always done, and Mrs. Pruitt had a pot of coffee and 2 dried apple pies waiting for them, which is a thing Utah men remember about an outfit for years afterward. Then they waited. They waited on the platform scale at the shed door, sack by sack, with Dorsey calling and Abel writing in the tally book, and Adeline standing, with her hands behind her back and her heart going like a bird's. And when it was done, and Abel had added the column 3 times because he did not trust himself, the split rock clip of 1886 stood at 20,800 pounds of wool in 71 sacks. 31 sacks of fine combing marked with 1 broad stripe. 26 sacks of medium clothing, 2 stripes. 8 sacks of low and breech, marked with a cross. 3 sacks of black and gray, marked with a filled circle. And 3 sacks of tags, standing off by themselves at the end of the row with nothing on them at all. 20,800 pound, Dorsey said. That is 1,100 pound over last year off the same band. That is the tags and the burr we shook out on the floor last year and packed anyway, Adeline said. And it is the second cuts we did not pack this year, and it is 140 fleeces that would have been ruined in the rain. It is not more wool, Mr. Pike. It is that we have not thrown any of it away. They hauled on the Friday, 4 wagons, 11 miles, and the sacks stood 7 feet tall and had to be roped in 3 tiers, and the outfit came into Lone Tree at 10:30 in the morning with 71 sacks of wool and no buyer. And the whole town came out onto the walk to watch them unload it onto the platform of a siding where the westbound would not even stop unless you flagged it. Adeline stood on the boards in her father's leather apron, with her hands black to the wrist with lampblack, and stacked her lines apart, so that a man standing anywhere on that platform could see the whole year at a glance. 1 stripe here, 2 stripes there, the crosses, the circles, and the 3 bare sacks of tags set out honestly at the end where he would find them first. At 5 minutes to noon, Milo Renfro's wagons came up the street. There were 3 of them, high-sided freight wagons with the boards on, and Renfro rode ahead of them on the bay, and he took his time getting down, and he had a leather case under his arm with the money in it, because he was a man who understood what money looks like when a person has not had any since March. Kerrigan, he said, 20,800 pound. I had it off Hollis, who had it off your own tally book, and no harm in it. 12 cents. That is $2,496, and I have got it here in this case in notes, and my wagons are stood behind me. And I will have every sack off this platform inside of 2 hours. He opened the case and let the light get at it, which was a thing Adeline had seen done in a mill office and had never forgotten. Because a man does not open a case in the sun unless he knows his argument is thin. There is no other buyer, he said. There is no other buyer this side of Rollins, and the westbound does not stop here, and by Monday you will be paying storage to the railroad on 71 sacks. Abel Kerrigan looked at the case, and then at the platform, and then, for a long moment, at the woman in the leather apron standing at the end of the row with her chin up and her hands black with lampblack. No, he said. No? No, thank you, Mr. Renfro. Renfro shut the case. On a woman's cards, he said, off a coat with hog fence. On my wife's word, said Abel Kerrigan, which was not strictly the case yet, and which was heard by everybody on that walk and repeated in Lone Tree, Wyoming territory for the next 50 years. Renfro drove his empty wagons home. They sat on that platform through the whole of Friday afternoon and all of Saturday morning. That was the hard part, and nobody in the family ever pretended otherwise afterward. The town watched them do it, The loafers came and went and came again. Hollis stood in the door of the mercantile with his arms folded, thinking about his account. Mrs. Pruitt sent bread down at noon. Tobin slept sitting up against a sack of the fine, combing with his hat over his face, and Dorsey Pike walked the length of that platform so many times he wore a shine on the boards, and Adeline sat on the tags with her father's apron across her knees and did not eat anything at all for a day and a half. Twice she got up and put her hand into the top of the number 1 line and stood there, with her eyes shut, checking her own work, the way a sorter does. And each time she came away sure, and each time being sure was worth about 40 minutes. On the Friday night they slept on the platform, all of them, because not one man would leave the wool. And somebody built a small fire of scrap lumber down at the end where it could not throw a spark, and Adeline sat with her back against a sack of the number 1 line, and Abel Kerrigan sat down beside her with a coat over his knees. "If he does not come," she said, "you will have lost about $2,400 listening to a woman you have known for 3 weeks. That is so. You may say it out loud. I would think better of you." "No," Abel said. "You have got it turned around, and I want to get this said before the sun comes up, because in the morning there will be men everywhere and I will not manage it." He looked out at the dark flats. "I was not gambling on the wool, Adeline. I do not know wool. I have handled it 13 years, and I did not know until Tuesday week that a sheep grows 2 different articles on the same back. What I know about is people, because that is all a man out here has got to study. And I have watched you for 3 weeks. I watched you go down on your knee in the dirt in front of 11 men who had decided not to learn your name. I watched you stand in the rain and stop the shearing over 140 wet sheep when you knew what it would cost, because you would not put a bad pound in my sack with your hand. So if that train goes by tomorrow and does not stop, then I will have lost a year's wool. I will not have lost anything I would miss." Adeline Fenn did not answer for a while. Then she put her head over on his shoulder, which was the first time she had touched him, and she went to sleep like that, on 71 sacks of wool, on a railroad platform in the territory of Wyoming, with everything she owned still fitting in 1 flour sack. The westbound came through at 9 on Saturday morning, and Dorsey flagged it, and it stopped. Ames Cutright stepped down off the second car with a leather sample bag in one hand and a flat tin in the other, and he was a stout, clean-shaven man near 60 in a charcoal suit with a gold watch chain across his front and round spectacles pushed up on his forehead, and he stood on that platform in the wind and looked down the row of 71 sacks for a good half-minute without saying a word to anybody. Then he walked to the end where the 3 bare sacks stood. "Whose notion was it," he said, to nobody in particular, "to put the tags where a buyer trips over them first?" "Mine, sir," Adeline said. He turned around and looked at her, and at the black leather apron with the shine worn across the belly of it, and something moved in his face. "I have seen that apron before," he said. "You have, sir, 11 years, in the top room, under the north windows. Ephraim Fenn's girl. Adeline Fenn. He is dead then. I had heard it and I hoped it was wrong." Ames Cutright took his spectacles down off his forehead. "Your father cost my house money exactly once in 11 years, Miss Fenn, and that was the day he refused to pass a shipment I had already bought, and he was right and I was wrong, and it saved us 4 times over the following spring. Now, let us see what is in these sacks, and I will tell you plainly that I have come off that train for the man's name and not for the wool, and the wool will have to answer for itself." He worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had a wool hook, and he opened the top of 16 sacks with it and dug down into 11 of them past his elbow, and he pulled samples out of the heart and not the top, which is where a buyer looks when he intends to buy and where he does not look when he intends to be polite. He measured staple against a rule. He held locks up against the light and pulled them and listened to them. He rubbed grease between his fingers and smelled it. He went through the black and gray line sack by sack, all 3 of them, and then he went back and did the fine combing again from the far end, and twice he stopped and looked up at Adeline over the spectacles and said nothing at all. At 11:30 he stood up straight and put his hands in the small of his back and said, "There is no black fiber in your white." "No, sir, none. Not a thread of it in 3,200 fleeces, which I do not believe, and I have looked in 11 sacks for it, and it is not there." He almost smiled. "There is no second cuts to speak of. There is no twine. The tie is the fleece's own neck. The fine is sorted honest to the shoulder and the side, and I would not take an ounce of it out. And there is not 1 pound of tag wool anywhere it should not be. Mr. Kerrigan, do you know what you have got standing on this platform?" "I am beginning to," Abel said. "You have got a clip that my house can buy without opening it," said Ames Cutright, "which is the only thing in this trade anybody actually pays for." He wrote it out on the top of a wool sack with a pencil, and he read it off in the wind, and the town of Lone Tree heard every line of it, and Adeline Fenn stood with her hands folded in front of her father's apron and did not move a muscle in her face. 9,200 pounds of fine combing at 28 cents the pound. $2,576. 7,600 pounds of medium clothing at 22 cents. $1,672. 2,400 pounds of low and breech at 16 cents. $384. 900 pounds of black and gray kept clean and kept apart at 18 cents, which he said was more than the line was worth, and which he said he was paying, because a man who separates his black without being asked will separate everything else. $162, and 700 pounds of tags at 9 cents, $63. 20,800 pounds, said Ames Cutright, free on board at this siding. Freight and commission mine, paid by draft on the Stock Growers Bank at Cheyenne, in the sum of $4,857. Dorsey Pike sat down on a sack of breech wool. Abel Kerrigan did not say anything at all for a moment, and when he did his voice was not steady, and what he said was, "Say the number again, please." $4,857, said the buyer. The same flock, the same 11 days, the same shed, the same men, the same 80 sacks, bought out of St. Joseph. $2,361 more than the cash in Milo Renfro's leather case, and better than twice what the whole of the previous year had brought, and every dollar of the difference had come off a wire table made out of a rusted horse fence by a woman who owned one flour sack. What happened after is the part Adeline liked best to tell, because it was the part with no fear in it. The draft went into the Stock Growers Bank at Cheyenne, and the money came back to Lone Tree, and the first thing Abel Kerrigan did with it, before the harness he needed, and before the winter hay, and before anything at all for himself, was walk across the street into the Mercantile and pay Hollis the whole of the account. 11 months of it, $416 and change, in front of 2 men who had been standing at that counter the previous March when Hollis had told him kindly that there was a limit. The second thing he did was pay the Utah crew their half-cent a head, 3,214 head, $16.07, which Wick Halloran took in silver and would not put in his pocket. He walked back down the platform with it in his open hand and gave it to Adeline. "For the table," he said. "I have shore in 4 countries, ma'am, and I have never once been asked to throw a fleece where it would do somebody some good. You will see hog fence in every shed in this basin inside of 2 years, and I will have put it there, and I will tell every one of them where it come from." He was wrong about the 2 years. It took 5. Milo Renfro came out to the Split Rock in the last week of June, which nobody expected, and he came alone and he took his hat off at the door, which nobody expected either. "I have been 9 years in this basin buying wool from men who did not know what they had," he said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of Mrs. Pruitt's coffee in front of him. "I have not cheated anybody. I have paid the price of an unsorted clip for an unsorted clip, and that is a fair trade, and I will say it standing up. But I am not a fool, Mrs. Kerrigan, or I am not one twice, and what I saw on that platform was the end of my business as I have run it." "It is the last week of June, Mr. Renfro," Adeline said. "I am not married until Sunday. I am early then, and I will be early again." He turned the cup around. "I will buy on the grade next May. 5 lines, your marks. I will pay within a cent of what a Boston house pays, and I will take it off your hands at the ranch and save you the haul. And there is a second thing, and I would rather say it in front of your husband so it is above board." "Say it," Abel said. "There are 11 outfits in this basin," Renfro said. "Every one of them will be standing in that shed by the middle of May next year wanting to know what a stripe means. I would like to be the man who brings them. Sort their clips here. Charge them for it. I will do the buying and the hauling, and I will not touch the sorting, because the whole value of the thing is that the sorter is not the buyer, and any man who cannot see that has no business in wool." Adeline Fenn looked at the lean man in the black frock coat for a long moment, and thought about her father, who had once refused to pass a shipment that his own house had already paid for. "1/4 cent a pound," she said. "And they take their tags home with them, because I will not have another outfit's tags in my shed." They were married on the first Sunday in June by Reverend Pardo, in the church at Lone Tree at 11 in the morning, with the wind blowing hard enough that they had to shut the door twice. There was the question of a dress, and the question was solved in a way Adeline had not expected and never got over. Mrs. Odell Pruitt cut it, and the ranch wife with the hide trunk, who was called Etta Doyle, and who had come down on the same coach and had watched her get off it with a flour sack, brought 8 yards of gray silk poplin she had been keeping for 4 years, and would not hear a word said about it. And the 2 of them sat in the kitchen of the Split Rock for 3 evenings, with Adeline standing on a chair between them. The whole basin came. All 9 of the Utah shearing crew stayed on an extra week to be there, and 2 who had already started for Ogden turned their wagon around and came back for it. Wick Halloran gave the bride away, having no other claim on the position than that nobody else stood up quicker. Dorsey Pike wept through the entire service and denied it for 30 years. Ames Cutright, who was 300 miles west at Green River by then, sent a telegram that said only, "Your father would have sorted the flowers," which Adeline had framed. They had the wedding dinner in the shearing shed, because it was the only building on the place big enough, with the trestles scrubbed and boards laid across them, and 81 people sat down to eat at the far end of it, and behind the head of the table, still standing on its trestles because nobody would let it be taken down, was 10 feet of 2x4 framing covered in rusted hog fencing. The following May, the Split Rock shed sorted its own clip and the clips of 4 neighbors, and Adeline stood at that table 22 days out of 31 and cleared, in fees alone, on other men's wool, $200 and $9. The May after that, it was 9 outfits, and she had to build a second table and train 2 women out of Lone Tree to stand at it. And by 1891 there were 3 tables in that shed, and the wool going east out of Lone Tree Siding had a name among the Boston houses, and men in the basin who had spent their lives calling sheep an insult were driving 40 miles with a wagon of fleeces too. Have a woman tell them what was on their own hindquarters. Cutright and Beale stopped a train at Lone Tree every June for 19 years. They had 3 children. The first was a boy, born the March after the wedding, and the second was a boy, and the third was a girl, and it was the girl who used to be carried down to the shed on her mother's hip before she could walk, and who stood on an upturned box at the end of the table from the time she was 6, and who by 9 could tell fine from half-blood with her eyes shut, and it was that girl who was still sorting wool at that same table in the spring of 1928, when the buyers came in motor cars instead of on the westbound, and the shed had electric light in it, and nothing else in it had changed at all. As for the flour sack, this is what became of it. Adeline never emptied it. She took the dress out, and the comb out, and the apron, and the rule, and the tin box of cards, and then she folded the sack itself and put it in the bottom drawer of the bureau in the room, with the window that looked west at the mountains, and it stayed there, and Abel knew it was there, and neither of them ever once made a speech about it, but she kept the yarn. The red carpet yarn that had tied the neck of it came out of that drawer every May for 41 years. When the sacks of No. 1 fine combing were sewed and pressed and marked with their single broad stripe of lampblack, Adeline Kerrigan took a needle and put 3 stitches of red yarn into the corner of every one of them, beside the stripe, and cut the thread and went on to the next. She did it the first year because there was a length of red yarn in her workbox, and it was the only thing she owned that had come the whole way with her. She went on doing it because of what happened in the 4th year, when a sack of split rock fine came into a wool warehouse on Summer Street in Boston, with the invoice lost somewhere between Cheyenne and the coast, and a floor man who had never heard of Wyoming looked at 3 stitches of red yarn in the corner and said, "That is the Kerrigan clip. Put it with the good." And it was baled and sold unopened, which in the wool trade is not a small thing, and is very nearly the only compliment the trade has. That was the whole of it. A woman came out on a coach with everything she owned in one flour sack and no trunk behind her on the freight, and she said so out loud on the boards in front of the town before anybody could find it out, because she had learned young that a thing said first is only a fact. And a rancher who had been 13 years in that country and who had been left once already by a woman who took the stove money, looked at the sack she was holding and did not think about what she had failed to bring. He thought about 80 empty sacks in the bed of his wagon and a year of his life lying loose on a shed floor. And he said the only sentence that mattered, which was, "Then fill my wool sacks. I have got 80 of them, and nobody to say what goes inside." And in the bottom drawer of that bureau, folded inside the flour sack where she kept it, was the letter he had written back to her the winter before, the one that had come to a cold boarding house on Common Street in Lawrence, Massachusetts, with the smell of sheep on it and a money order folded into the crease, in answer to a woman who had told a stranger the worst of herself in the middle of the 2nd page. There were 11 words in it, and Adeline Kerrigan could say them from memory until the day she died. "Then bring the sack. There is room here for us both.